Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's live stream. There's a chat feature down to the right, in which I welcome all of you to share your name and where you're tuning in from as we wait for others to gather for today's talk. All right, and with that, I want to say thanks again so much for joining and tuning in this afternoon. My name is Kirsty Rupert, and I work for San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance on our Conservation Science and Wildlife Health Department. As an associate director on our community engagement team, I work to integrate the human dimensions information into conservation strategies. And it was in this context that I first got to join these two guests here on today's webinar. I was attending a Sea Otter research meeting, and they were both so welcoming to me, encouraged my involvement in socioeconomics work related to sea otter recovery. And part of that introduction was learning as much as possible, which is central to the objective of Sea Otter Awareness Week. So with that, I'm going to welcome Heather Barrett to share a bit more about this week-long celebration.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. And we love having you join us with anything sea otter related. And we are so excited to be back here again with San Diego Zoo. My name is Heather Barrett. I'm a sea otter biologist. And I'm the science communication director for Sea Otter Savvy. And I just wanted to give a little highlight. It's Sea Otter Awareness Week. We're towards the end of it, but I'm just so excited we're able to be here today. Thank you for joining us. Sea Otter Awareness Week occurs every year during the last full week of September. So you guys can go to next year's calendar, look for that full week and add it right now. And we will be here again. And it is organized in partnership with Sea Otter Savvy, Defenders of Wildlife, California State Parks, Alaka Alliance, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and the Marine Mammal Center. And we want to thank all of our collaborators and community members that join us in spreading awareness. Now, this year marks the 23rd year, and the theme this year is anchored in hope. And so we're providing a metaphor for optimism, stability, and security in a challenging world. This week also highlights Sea Otter Savvy's Sea Otter Recovery and Community Engagement Program, and that's highlighted by our We Were Here Sea Otter artwork, which educates communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters, and we also offer a survey for community involvement. So the Southern Sea Otter Range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south in California to Año Nuevo State Park in the north of California. And sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast. They are ecologically and they are also culturally significant, and there's increasing discussion regarding possible reintroduction into historical habitats. So to move forward, government agencies, sea otter research community, we want to engage with communities and stakeholders like you to hear your perspectives. So if you are interested in sea otter recovery, please take the Sea Otter survey, share your thoughts, your voice matters. The links and website will be made available at the end of this, and you can also use the QR code. But with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kirsty, and I'm excited to hear from Tim. Take it away, guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. As part of this entire week, we've been hearing from many groups about efforts to protect sea otters and how each of us can contribute. And so one really great way to do that is engaging with conservation organizations, which is why, in part, I'm so excited for San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance to be hosting today's webinar. After Tim's presentation, we're planning on time for questions, so please share those in the chat feature throughout this session. Before handing over, I'd just like to share a small bit about San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. We're a conservation organization with 2 front doors at our zoo and safari park, and our conservation work is situated in 8 eco-regional hubs that are in large overlap with biodiversity hotspots around the world. Some of this work focuses on ocean conservation, including efforts that target kelp forest ecosystems in which sea otters play an important role. And really learning about that role is essential for their conservation and management. And for that reason, I am so excited to introduce today's speaker. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Tinker. Tim is a research ecologist who recently retired from the U.S. Geological Survey. Though it does not seem that retirement has slowed him down, he continues his work as an adjunct professor at both Dalhousie University and Simon Fraser University in Canada. His academic background includes a Bachelor's of Science from the University of Guelph, a Master's of Science from the University of Waterloo, and a PhD from University of California, Santa Cruz. Since 1993, Tim has focused his research on sea otters, studying their populations and their roles as apex predators across coastal ecosystems, from California and Washington to British Columbia, Alaska, and the Russian Commander Islands. Over the years, he's led long-term studies looking at why some sea otter populations remain threatened. And Tim's research spans a wide variety of topics within coastal marine ecology, including foraging behavior, spatial ecology, and the direct and indirect interactions between large vertebrates and other species in nearshore environments, including humans. And also research that tells us what that means for broader ecosystem processes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Tinker. After you share your slides, I'll give you the thumbs up. It looks great, Tim. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning or afternoon to everybody. I say that because for me it's afternoon. I'm in Nova Scotia, and as you may already tell from my voice, I am recovering from the flu, so I apologize in advance for my rather strange sounding voice and any throat clearing or coughing that might happen. But I will do my best to suppress those. Today, I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about a rather ominous sounding thing, a catastrophic and an unintended experiment, and what we have learned from that, how we've used that to learn about sea otters and their social and ecological importance. And spoiler alert, the catastrophic and unintended experiment I am talking about is the North Pacific fur trade. Let's see here. So the talk I'm presenting today is actually drawn mostly from a recent book chapter that I wrote with some colleagues. In this book, you can see here, shameless plug, I guess. This is Sea Otter Conservation 2. If you seek out this book, it's got a lot of great stuff in it. Chapter 6 has the title of my talk today, and I would like to acknowledge my co-authors from that chapter, Dr. Ann Solomon, Sean Larson, and Ian McKechnie. The work I'm going to be presenting today is drawn from their work and collaborations with many, many different scientists. And I'm going to be referring to many of those collaborations today. Okay, so I'm going to start with a really important one, the one who began this whole story. My longtime friend, colleague, mentor, Dr. James Estes, who passed away this last year. Jim was indeed the one who first recognized that the sea otter recovery from the fur trade did represent an opportunistic experiment, and he used that to understand how sea otters were affecting nearshore ecosystems. And his work is what paved the way for almost everything that I will be talking about today. He was the one who discovered the relationship between sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp forests. Most of you probably know the story. If you don't, I will be going over it. But in fact, it is how sea otters are able to promote the abundance of healthy kelp forests by limiting urchins. And that's what makes them a keystone predator. That was really Jim's story. But many other of the topics I'll cover today were work that was began by Jim. He laid the foundation, and many of us, his students and friends and colleagues, are continuing to build on that. So I just wanted to, this talk is definitely a tribute to his life and legacy. So when we talk about the Pacific fur trade, we're talking actually not about one, but actually two massive experiments. And for those of you who have not heard of the North Pacific fur trade, this is something that happened in the North Pacific, as the name suggests, beginning in the mid-1700s, when first Russia, but then other European nations and North America countries got into the harvesting of fur, including sea otter fur and fur seal fur, starting in the Aleutian Islands, which are the island chain that stretches off southwest Alaska. So before 1740, sea otters were distributed all around the North Pacific coastline, including all through the Aleutian Islands. And we know this from a variety of archaeological evidence and other bits of information that sea otters had a pretty much continuous distribution around the North Pacific rim. The fur trade began in the mid-1700s and officially ended in 1911 by international treaty, but by that time, sea otters were virtually extinct throughout their range. There were just a few tiny remnant colonies from which today's sea otters were descended. So it was a near extinction event. So that is the removal experiment of which I am referring. And then after protection, they began to slowly recover. And they recovered at different speeds in different areas, depending where the remnant colonies were. And this discontinuous pattern of recovery offered an almost ideal experimental framework for testing out the effects of sea otters on different things. So this is the recovery experiment, the second experiment of which I'm referring to. Before we get going, I'm going to actually cover a few important concepts. I've already referred to some of these, but I think it will help to understand how we have used these two massive experiments as experiments to learn about how these nature works, about how nearshore ecosystems work, and how sea otters contribute to that. So the key ingredients we need for any experiment are treatments or perturbations, controls, and replication. The treatment is essentially the experimental manipulation. We do something to the system, and that we refer to that as the treatment. But we need to do that to more than one system, because if we just do it to one system, we are not sure about what the results mean. So we have to replicate that experiment. And in this case, the treatment replicates might be different individuals, or in the case of my talk today, they're different populations of sea otters. And then we also have to have control replicates, which are other replicates, say in this case, populations to which we did not apply the treatment. So that's what we mean by an experiment. And experiments can either be designed by people, experimenters, and then instigated, or they can actually be opportunistic. And it's that latter type of experiment, the opportunistic one, that we're taking advantage of today. So that might be some huge perturbation like a forest fire, or a non-natural perturbation like a worldwide fur trade. But either case, you need something that perturbs the system, and that's your treatment. Another important type of design, of experimental design, are before-after control treatment designs, or BACI designs. And in this type of experimental design, you have a number of replicates or treatments. In this case, again, these might be sea otter populations. And then a treatment is applied to some of them, but not others. So we have treatment replicates and control replicates. And the treatment is applied at some point in time, and then you collect data from both before it was applied and after. So that's the before-after part. And I'll mention that, in fact, most of the natural experiments that we have used for sea otter recovery correspond to this before-after control treatment design. And finally, a particular type of experiment that's conducted in ecology are called removal or addition experiments. And these are really the foundation of how we understand how many different ecosystems work, how many different ecosystem processes work. We do that when you just look at a system and you haven't perturbed it. It's hard to know what components of the system, say what species, are affecting other species. You only really know that when you remove something and then see how the system changes. And it was a researcher, a mentor of Jim, in fact, Bob Payne, who applied this to coastal ecosystems for the first time. And he was the one who encouraged Jim to conduct his experiments in the Aleutian Islands, or to treat that as a natural experiment in the Aleutian Islands. Bob did a similar thing in the Northwest Pacific. He went to islands and he removed sea stars, which were a predator, a top predator in the intertidal. And then he did this to see how the system would change and to begin to describe the interactions between the different components of the system. And this was really important because before Bob did this work, most people thought of predators as essentially being the ecological equivalent of window dressing. They just didn't matter that much. They were up at the top of the food webs, but whether they were there or not didn't really matter. What really drove things was the bottom of the food web. And Bob had a different idea. He thought that predators actually were performing really important roles, functions in ecosystems. And he demonstrated this through his removal experiments, showed that when sea stars were present or absent from the system, the whole system would change. So in both Bob's experiment and in the natural experiment of the fur trade, and in really many ecological experiments, the critical things that are being removed or added are actually not individuals or populations or species. They're relationships. Ecologists like to refer to these as interactions, but really they're relationships between different components of the system. This is a picture of a food web, in this case, actually from San Nicolas Island. It's a food web where sea otters are present. And you can see those arrows connecting different sea otters with other components of the system. And all those arrows represent all the different relationships in the system. And you can just find those mathematically, or we can define those in terms of their effects when we remove one component of the system, how the rest of the system changes. Okay, so those are our background topics. And at this point, I'd like everybody to maybe close your eyes, take a couple deep breaths, and then take a big step back. And we're going to think about deep history. So sea otters in the Northeast Pacific have a very long history. They've been along the coastline of the North Pacific for about 1 million years in their current form, or what we would recognize as sea otters. So if we went back 1 million years, you would see very much the same type of thing you would see in an uninhabited part of the coast right now. You would see sea otters, kelp forests, and a lot of the same species that we see today. And they were there, and so this long purple line represents 1 million years. If we look at the last 10,000 years, that's that little blip at the end, that's the portion of the timeline where sea otters and humans interacted. And let's zoom in on that. So there's the last 10,000 years. For most of that 10,000 years, sea otters interacted with the indigenous peoples of North America. And I'm here referring to only this side of the Pacific. There were other interactions on the other side of the Pacific. I'm not going to be talking about that today, although they're similar, but let's focus on this side of the Pacific. So for 10,000 years, indigenous communities and sea otters coexisted. And we know about that both through traditional knowledge of indigenous communities today, and also through archaeological evidence that shows an unbroken history and timeline of sea otter presence in midden sites up and down the coast throughout that entire period. So we know sea otters were hunted by people in many areas, but also that they were never hunted to extinction or exclusion, because there's no period of time or area from which they're absent over that whole time period. Okay, that brings us up to the last 300 years or so. And that was when the Europeans arrived, and that's when the fur trade began. So that little red line right near the end, that's our first experiment, the fur trade near extinction event. That's our first experimental perturbation. And then that little yellow line right at the end, that reflects all the time period over which everything that Western science has written about sea otters have occurred during that period. That's our 20th century recovery period. And one of the main things I want you to take away from this is that our understanding of sea otters is heavily biased. It's been biased by the fact that they're recovering from this massive near extinction event, but also it's such a short time period. So our understanding of sea otters and their relationships to the rest of coastal ecosystems and to people are really based on this remarkably short period of time. We're still learning. We're still students, and that's important to remember. Okay, so let's get started now, the removal experiment. So this is, of course, the fur trade. Prior to the fur trade, as mentioned, sea otters were present throughout the North Pacific. In many or most areas, there are probably near equilibrium densities, although we do know, again, from the archaeological evidence I just mentioned, that people did reduce their density in areas particularly close to human settlements. So some populations were probably more at moderate density. However, they were present just about everywhere. And then the fur trade began, and within about 100 years, otters were reduced to near extinction everywhere. And by 1900, as mentioned, the fur trade ended. So, as I mentioned before, what we're really interested in ecology are interactions or relationships. So what were relationships? What were the relationships that were lost because of the fur trade during this first experiment? And I've already alluded to one of those, and that is food web interactions, interactions between sea otters and other components of the nearshore ecosystem that sea otters either eat or are eaten by the things that sea otters eat, etc., the food web. And this is the work that Jim really pioneered, and that started in around 1970. So as mentioned, when sea otters are present in the system, they are they have voracious appetites, and they're the only species that are capable of limiting the abundance of urchins, which are the predominant grazer in nearshore coastal ecosystems. So sea otters exert this very strong top-down effect on urchins, reduces urchin abundance to very low abundance, and so urchins no longer are exerting this high grazing rate on kelp, and kelp forests flourish. And because I'm a scientist, I have to show you these graphs because scientists don't believe anyone will believe anything without seeing data. So you're going to be seeing throughout some graphs, and I'll try and walk you through them and what they mean. You're also going to be seeing references that you see here. You can ignore those unless you're interested in reading more about the topics I'm talking about, in which case you're welcome to go. Those are the primary journal references for the information that I'm talking about. Okay, so sea urchin biomass, when sea otters are present in the system, is very low. Urchins therefore are exerting a very low grazing rate. Kelp density is high. When you remove sea otters from the system and therefore remove that relationship between sea otters and urchins, the whole system changes. Sea otters are now, as you can see at that little food chain on the right, exerting a very strong top-down effect on kelp. And so sea urchin biomass is now very high, urchin grazing rate is high, and kelp biomass is very low. So kelp forests become very sparse and infrequent, and most of the bottom of the ocean in the nearshore environment is dominated by these carpets of urchins we refer to as urchin barrens. So those are probably the food web relationships that most people are familiar with and that we know most about, and that's largely due to the work that Jim did in the 70s and 80s and 90s. However, we're increasingly realizing that there were a lot of other relationships that were lost during the fur trade. Many other species are impacted by the loss of these direct and indirect sea otter effects. And I'm just showing you a whole bunch of pictures here. There are long and involved stories that involve every one of these species and how they were affected both by sea otter loss and then by sea otter recovery. I'm going to tell you some of these stories, but not all of them. For now, I'm going to focus on one story that you might not have heard of. It's not perhaps as well known as the others. That's this strange looking beast right here. It's actually not a beast, it's a coralline algae, Clastromorphum. Clastromorphum is a reef-forming coralline algae. And what that means, it's in cold water areas, it's the equivalent of a coral reef. It's not coral, it's actually an algae, but it forms large reefs just like a coral reef. And it, in fact, forms most of the reefs in the Aleutian Islands are made of coralline algae. So those reefs are actually living reefs. And that's what kelp grows on in places like the Aleutian Islands. However, Clastromorphum can experience destructive bioerosion from urchin grazing when sea otters are not present in the system, and sea otters are not limiting, therefore not able to limit urchin abundance. And it turns out this is getting worse with climate change because the Clastromorphum does not grow as rapidly in warmer waters. And so with the combined effects of climate change and the lack of sea otters, urchin grazing actually happens reduces the Clastromorphum abundance faster than it can grow. And so you actually have these reefs eroding. However, when sea otters are present in the system, that doesn't happen. So this plot here shows you the grazing rates when sea otters are present, when the grazing rates are very low, and when sea otters are absent, when the grazing rate is very high. And if sea otters are removed, in this case, actually, the removal is a more recent decline that happened in the Aleutian Islands. I'll talk about in a little bit. But this is exactly what would have happened in the fur trade. With sea otters removed, the urchins increase in abundance and the grazing rate goes up. And that leads to, as I mentioned, to a degradation in the abundance of these reef-forming algae. And again, the reference at the bottom is the paper that you can read about if you want to learn more about this system. Another type of relationship that was lost during the fur trade is sort of an invisible one to most people, and that is adaptive genetic diversity. These types of relationships are relationships between genes and the environment. They're therefore cleverly called gene by environment relationships. They're basically the genetic diversity that allows species to respond to differences in the environment. It also gives them the adaptive capacity to respond to new perturbations or new environmental conditions that they haven't experienced before. Pardon me. So the fur trade led to, as mentioned, it was catastrophic, led to a 99% population decline throughout the North Pacific. And when populations are brought down to that low abundance, they tend to lose genetic diversity through genetic drift. So sea otters have lost about 30 to 40% of their pre-fur trade diversity. And this they have much lower diversity than similar species, and particularly in genes controlling for adaptation to immune function and disease response. So that lost diversity may be very important for their ability to be resilient to future things like emerging diseases and environmental changes. And finally, the other type of relationships that were lost were human sea otter cultural traditions and coexistence. And I mentioned that a little bit at the beginning. But sea otters played very important cultural roles to First Nations, Indigenous communities all around the North Pacific. There are many stories, mythologies, and artwork and carvings referring to many of these stories. That's these two amulets that you see from the Supiaq tribe in Southeast Alaska were carried by sea otter hunters as good luck charms. And they actually show half people, half otters, because it was believed that people could transform into sea otters when they got into trouble. And the picture in the middle shows two very famous high-ranking chiefs meeting, and they're both wearing their sea otter ceremonial robes. So sea otters played really important roles in culture, and we don't know, of course, many of these relationships because they were lost. Okay, so with that, after all that gloominess, let's start talking about the recovery experiment. So I've already, you can already imagine one of the things that was going to be reestablished, and that will be those food web relationships. However, as sea otters have recovered to different types of habitats, we're slowly, bit by bit, piecing together different types of interactions in different types of habitats. So that first one I mentioned are typical relationships that you see on outer rocky coastlines, where sea otters reduce the abundance of urchins, and that leads to the proliferation of kelp forests. And indeed, we have seen that in all the rocky coastlines where sea otters have recovered. We've seen exactly that transition. However, sea otters recovered to habitats where we have not are only recently being able to study them because they've only recently arrived in these habitats. We're seeing new types of interactions that have surprising consequences. So, for instance, sea otters moving into estuaries limit the abundance of these large red crabs, short rock crabs. And those rock crabs, it turns out, were limiting the abundance of grazers of algae. And so with the kelp crabs being reduced by otters, those grazers increased in abundance, and that leads actually to healthier eelgrass forests when they don't have the algal epiphytes. And so this has led to a dramatic increase in the abundance and the health of eelgrass forests in an estuary where sea otters have recovered. In that same estuary, they've also, it turns out, reduced the abundance of invasive green crabs, which is a handy little thing. And then in salt marsh habitats, which are adjacent to those eelgrass habitats, when sea otters move into the tidal creeks, they begin to consume large numbers of these burrowing shore crabs. And it turns out that leads to increases in the health and the below ground biomass of pickleweed, which is the dominant vegetation in these salt marsh habitats. And that leads to a stabilization of the ground, stabilization of banks of the tidal creeks, and a reduction in erosion rates. So these are unexpected benefits of sea otter food web relationships that are being restored. In the last few decades, there's increasing reports also of sea otters having relationships with other predators, that kind of relationship where they get eaten. So increasing reports of sea otters as prey. This includes terrestrial predators such as gray wolves in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia, and also grizzly bears in Southwest Alaska, but also marine predators, including white sharks in California and Oregon, and killer whales in various places in Alaska, but particularly in Southwest Alaska. And in areas where these predation effects are particularly strong, you can develop what is called a landscape fear. So I know that does sound ominous. It's essentially a ecological term for behavioral responses of prey to high-risk predation areas. Where prey, being smart, and sea otters are definitely smart, learn where the areas of high-risk predation are, and they learn to avoid those areas, and that changes the distribution. And as an example of this is the distribution of sea otters around Adak Island in the early 1990s, when I first began to study sea otters with Jim. And they were distributed all around Adak Island. And then in the early 90s, killer whales began to consume them, and they consumed quite a few of them, actually, led to a very dramatic decline. And by the mid 2010s or 2015, sea otters, there had been about a 90% decline in sea otter abundance. But as you can see, the distribution has changed enormously with these hot spots where all the remaining sea otters are located. And those hot spots always turn out to correspond to areas where killer whales cannot get to. So Clam Lagoon in this case, and Bay of Islands. Two different areas where sea otters have refuge from the predators. And that concentration in these hotspots means that they're absent from most other areas. That's the landscape of fear I'm mentioning. And that means that their ecological effects are also limited to just these hotspot areas. And then they don't occur around the remaining areas. And I want you to remember that effects when it's going to come back when I talk about human relationships. Okay, another type of relationship, though, with predators is a complementary relationship with predators. And in this case, the complementary relationship I'm referring to is between sea otters and sunflower stars, or Pycnopodia, that really large, massive orange sea star you see in the picture at the bottom. So these sunflower stars are really important predators in the nearshore, just like sea otters. In fact, they have the same general habitats as sea otters. And they eat a lot of the same types of prey, although mostly smaller versions of that same prey. And sunflower stars were relatively abundant until about 2014, when during a heat wave they declined massively. In fact, they disappeared almost entirely around large areas of the coast due to sea star wasting disease, a disease that only recently the cause was just discovered. So again, being a scientist, I have to show you some data to show you how it was discovered through a couple different studies, one in British Columbia and one around Monterey Peninsula in California, that sea otters and sea stars together were actually performing complementary functional reductions of prey, and their effects were better were much more pronounced when both predators are present. So these data are from the British Columbia study. When both sea otters and Pycnopodia are absent from the system, as mentioned, sea urchins are very abundant, and you can the top panel shows you the abundance of large, medium, and small urchins. And you can see that both large and medium urchins are very abundant in the absence of sea otters and Pycnopodia. There's very high grazing rates, and so kelp abundance on the bottom panel is very, very low. In places where sea otters are absent, the Pycnopodia are present. The Pycnopodia are very good at limiting the medium-sized urchins, but not the large ones. And because the large ones have higher grazing rates, that means that grazing rates are still pretty high, not quite as high. And so kelp abundance is still relatively low, although a little bit higher than it was without Pycnopodia. If otters are present in the system but not Pycnopodia, such as after the sea star wasting disease, sea otters are very good at controlling large urchins, but not medium-sized ones. And so they reduce urchin grazing rate quite a bit, and kelp abundance is much higher. However, when both predators are in the system, then all size classes of urchins are effectively controlled, and you have the most abundant kelp forests. So having both predators together in the system leads to more effective top-down control, and therefore preservation of kelp forests with both predators present. Pardon me. Another rather unexpected type of relationship that is established is a genetic relationship between sea otters and plant genetic diversity. This was discovered by a student, Erin Foster, during her PhD in British Columbia, and was subsequently written up for the paper you can see below in Science. So you should definitely seek that out if you want to learn more about this story. So it goes back again to eelgrass, such as we were just looking at in Elkhorn Slough. When sea otters are absent from the system, they're not digging up clams, and so you tend to have fairly thick forests of eelgrass in British Columbia, and there's less nutrient impairment in British Columbia, so the eelgrass was actually healthier in the absence of sea otters. When sea otters return to the system in Vancouver Island, they dig for clams a lot, and they dig for clams in eelgrass beds, and that leads to all these pits being dug up in eelgrass beds, and you can see the eelgrass is more sparse and spread out with otter pits in between. This sort of stresses the eelgrass, and eelgrass, when it gets stressed, likes to flower and undergoes sexual reproduction, and so that's what happens. There's much more flowering occurring, much more sexual reproduction occurring from the eelgrass, and here's the data. As a result of more frequent sexual reproduction, you get an increase in genetic diversity and allelic richness. And this was confirmed in multiple places, both in the mainland and Vancouver Island, that when sea otters have been present and established for at least 10 years in the system, you get an increase in genetic diversity of the eelgrass as a response to the sea otter digging and change in the density of eelgrass. Okay, and now back to human relationships. human relationships with sea otter. This is something I talked about, what was lost before the fur trade and what is being recovered now as sea otters are returning to the areas from which they were lost. And those interactions with people are resuming. And in many cases, this leads to challenges, in particular because sea otters and coastal communities tend to consume the same types of food, particular things like intertidal clams. And so where sea otters are recovering, this tends to reduce the abundance of clams. And in many cases, those clams are important as subsistence food resources for coastal indigenous communities in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. So this has led to a lot of interest in how humans and sea otters coexisted before the fur trade and how they might coexist again after the fur trade, where you have both sea otters present, but also where coastal communities are still have access to abundant clam beds. And one of these experiments, again, an unexpected experiment, occurred in Southeast Alaska and was documented in a paper by Tori Gora, a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz. And this involved an increase in hunting by indigenous community members around Sitka, and they're allowed under the Mammal Protection Act to hunt sea otters in Alaska for handicraft and subsistence type purposes. So the hunters around Sitka began to focus their hunting on sea otters in the inner part of the sound, and this caused sea otters to move, that landscape of fear effect, to move out of the sound, of the inner sound, that is, and out to the outer parts of Sitka Sound. Here's our data. Our panels showing, the top panel shows sea otter abundance, and all the panels show distance to Sitka on the horizontal axis. And hunting pressure is highest close to Sitka, and it's low the farther away you get from Sitka. And so as you can see in the top panel, sea otter abundance, which used to be abundant all throughout the sound, has now decreased dramatically the closer you get to Sitka, but is still high once you get about 20 kilometers away from Sitka. And this has led to an increase in urchin abundance close to Sitka, and a reduction in kelp density. And the urchins there are used as other shellfish for subsistence food by the local communities. So this sort of localized spatial exclusion via hunting and then via the behavioral response of sea otters may be one of the ways that that humans and sea otters coexisted, as it allows for both humans to have access to local shellfish resources, but then still have healthy sea otter populations nearby. Another place where this is being considered are the Canadian archipelago, Haida Gwaii in British Columbia. And in case you don't know where that is, here's a map of the west coast of North America and British Columbia. And you can see the Haida Gwaii archipelago just below Southeast Alaska and just to the north of Vancouver Island. So sea otters are returning to Haida Gwaii naturally. Actually, they're recolonizing from the mainland. A few sea otters have moved over and are now reproducing on Haida Gwaii. So the recovery of sea otters is happening naturally in Haida Gwaii, and coastal communities there are, based on the experience of communities in Southeast Alaska, are concerned and really want to know how they're going to coexist with otters as they recover. This led to a project led by the Haida Nation and Parks Canada, and many collaborators, of which I was one, of this project, which I'm not going to try to pronounce the Haida version because I have the flu and it's very hard to pronounce. But the English translation is The Sea Otters Return to Haida Gwaii. This project is a project we began in 2020, and it was a 3-year project to begin to help plan for the natural sea otter recovery in Haida Gwaii. So one of the objectives was to envision possible changes to coastal ecosystems and the key focal species that Haida communities were interested in, like urchins, intertidal clams, and kelp. And it was recognized that the effects of sea otters was going to be different in different types of habitats. So in rocky habitats, it's anticipated that sea otters will reduce urchin abundance, as they have in other places, leading to the increase in kelp forests, which could be beneficial because it will also lead to increase in kelp forest fishes. However, in soft sediment areas, otters will dig for clams, as they have in other areas, and that will reduce the abundance of clams. And some of those clams are heavily relied on by Haida communities as subsistence foods resources. So there's concern about this. So the other objective of the project was to develop socio-ecological model to explore different management scenarios, such as excluding otters from localized areas. One of those areas we considered was Kamshwa Inlet. And so I'm a little low on time, so I'm not going to talk about this too much. But basically, developed an ecosystem model together with the tribal elders from Haida Nation, community members, and scientists. Put together a lot of different data and traditional knowledge to build this ecological model, and we used it to project how anticipated changes in key species would occur as the otters recovered under different management scenarios. So in Kamshwa Inlet, if there's no exclusion and otters are recovered naturally, within 50 years, it's anticipated to be almost complete reduction in intertidal clam density. And that doesn't mean that clams are gone entirely, it just means that they're such low sizes and density that there'll be no effective clam digging within that area. But there would be an increase in kelp and a reduction in urchins. However, if otters were largely excluded from Kamshwa Inlet, the way that we just saw before in the example for Southeast Alaska in Sitka Sound, it's anticipated within 50 years there would still be harvestable intertidal clams. And there would be, of course, also more modest increases in kelp and reductions in urchins. So these are some of the scenarios that are being discussed and evaluated by the Haida community. And there's similar ongoing projects in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. Another one of these is Coastal Voices, and there's the website if you want to go explore that. But to really reimagine human sea otter coexistence as sea otters recover. And one of the things that are common about these projects are really basing them on community, on ground up interactions with communities and community knowledge exchanges. And so these have been held in communities both in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. And also documenting traditional knowledge and archaeological information to help understand what things look like prior to the fur trade. And finally, putting all this together to co-develop socio-ecological models to explore scenarios that ensure both community food security as well as healthy and ecologically functioning sea otter populations. So finally, just a few words about the fact that all of these systems are still in transition. That is, sea otters are not done recovering. They're really very much in the process of recovering. And that means many of the features of sea otter populations that we see now are actually transient dynamics. They're not going to be occurring anymore once sea otters have reached their equilibriums. And one of these examples are large male rafts that you see, particularly at the colonizing, the spreading edges of populations like Southeast Alaska. There's these huge male rafts that form and move into new habitat and have really strong effects on things like crabs and clams. Those large male rafts are really an epiphenomenon of the fur trade removal and then the recovery. And once sea otter populations actually recover to equilibrium, you don't tend to see these huge male rafts in more established or long established populations. And that means that some other dynamics, such as these really strong, dramatic impacts of sea otters on geoduck clams and Dungeness crabs, are also transient dynamics that occur as sea otters, particularly these large male rafts, first move into an area. They definitely have these very dramatic depression effects on these types of invertebrate prey, and that is of legitimate concern both for indigenous communities, but also for commercial fishing enterprises that really rely on these fisheries. However, there's a lot of evidence that longer-term trends in food web dynamics, including abundance and size of prey species and commercial species, will change as sea otters approach equilibrium, and in some cases there will be recoveries. One project exploring this was in Elkhorn Slough, where we explored the changes in clam crab populations as sea otters recovered, and we did see in long-term projection models a slight recovery of clams over time. And in fact, that is being borne out in areas of central California now, where pismo clams that were once depleted by sea otters when they first recovered are now themselves beginning to recover. We're seeing relatively high densities again of pismo clams in central California and even in Monterey Bay, areas where sea otters are present and are very abundant. So that's, again, very encouraging as far as that particular species goes, but it's also a reminder that long-term trends in food dynamics are going to be very different than those initial transient dynamics we see when otters first recover. So again, this is a reminder that these systems are still in transition. We are still discovering what fully recovered populations look like, their roles in coastal systems, and the full scope of their relationships. So there's lots of work to do for the next generation of researchers and conservation scientists. So finally, in conclusion, catastrophic fur trade removal experiment and the subsequent recovery experiment has in fact informed much of what we now know about sea otter ecology. Ironically, countless relationships were lost, ecological, cultural, behavioral, demographic, and there were cascading consequences across coastal landscapes. However, the recovery of sea otters and these relationships is still ongoing. Relationships we've discovered are undoubtedly far outnumbered by ones we've yet to learn about. And a final reminder that sea otter populations are really not fully recovered in most areas. Most of these populations are still in transition, and so many of the phenomena we associate with otters really represent transient dynamics. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
I'm imagining many people clapping in the background. Tim, thank you so much for distilling an incredible body of scientific work into the session with us and also giving us perspective of kind of broader relative timelines for these natural experiments. So thank you so much. For those of you listening in, please use the chat feature to submit some questions that we can share with Tim over the next 10 or 15 minutes. I'll kick us off with a question, Tim. You've done so much collaborative science, and I'm wondering if you think about the ways in which those findings have been integrated into conservation planning and management, what factors have really helped that integration in your experience?
Thank you for the question. And again, I apologize for my voice. It has been degrading over time.
No, I think you're doing great. And also, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us while you're under the weather.
No worries. So, the first, I guess the first part of that response is in your question itself is collaboration. Collaboration has been, well, absolutely fundamental to my career. And that's definitely something I took away from Jim Estes, my mentor, as well. I mean, that you can definitely do some science on your own. And that's not a bad thing. But for really big types of questions, and particularly these types of systems that span entire ocean basins, and the types of complexities that we've seen, you do much better by collaborating broadly with many different people in many different disciplines. And I think that is part of the solution to untangling these and to therefore ultimately making better management decisions, is bringing together multiple types of expertise and also multiple types of knowledge. And so that the second part of my answer actually relates to some of those human social interactions I mentioned towards the end of my talk. I think in some of those projects in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia, I learned as much or more than I've learned throughout the rest of my career about topics I had no idea about by interacting with scientists, but with non-scientists, with community members, with hereditary chiefs of these tribes, and with local fishermen, about sort of both natural history and the social considerations, and perspectives that I think are really, really important. And we all, the key thing about those collaborations is they were done in a non-hostile, non-confrontational way, but rather over a prolonged period, with lots of discussions and gatherings, sharing of knowledge and respect for the different groups, and the fact that not everybody had the same perspective. But together, what comes out of that, I think, are going to be much more effective strategies and decisions. So that's something I think that is going to be key going forward. As undoubtedly there's going to be more human sea otter conflicts as sea otters recover into other areas. And so I think we do a much better job than has been done in the past at managing those interactions.
Thanks for that reflection. I definitely, what it made me think of are some of the other talks that have been shared during Sea Otter Awareness Week this week and in past years in regards to some of those cultural and social relationships with sea otters. So this is almost endorsing looking into Sea Otter Awareness Week's talks more broadly to gather information on those topics as well. There's a few other questions that are coming through the chat. The first is someone asking about given genetic erosion that took place, are there studies to measure diversity and possibly to enhance diversity through deliberate relocation?
Pardon me.
Sorry, Tim, take a minute.
That's okay. And it turns out it's worse when I stop talking. So that is a fantastic question. Um, that's a very challenging question, but a fantastic one. So yes, indeed, the studies have both been completed and more work is underway, but there has been some excellent work and I have some of the references both on my slide. I had them and also in the book chapter. There's many references. In fact, Sean Larson was one of the co-authors of that chapter with me, and she is really one of the leaders in knowledge of sort of genetic diversity in sea otters. So the short answer to that is there is reason for hope. It turns out so one of I mentioned the diversity part, but there's also the flip side of diversity is the buildup of mutations. It's referred to as genetic load. And that's also something that is relatively high, particularly in southern sea otters, which had the smallest bottleneck. They were the ones that were brought to the lowest abundance for the longest amount of time and haven't had the chance to exchange genetic information with the northern populations. Whereas prior to the fur trade, there was a continuous distribution, and so there was genetic exchange throughout the entire range. So in both the case of diversity and the genetic load, relatively small amounts of exchange with other populations over generations, a few animals per generation, is actually sufficient to ameliorate both of those factors. So yes, the work that is being done now is to actually begin to model that to get an idea of how close populations might have to be. Because right now the biggest gap is between the southern sea otters in California and then the northern sea otters, where southern Washington state is the farthest they extend. So there's this very big gap over which no genetic exchange is happening. That's just too far for otters to disperse. So some of the work now is being done to get an idea of what sort of spatial distribution might allow for even the small amounts of exchange of animals that would allow for both sharing of genetic diversity between populations and then reduction of that genetic load for southern sea otters. And it's important to remember this is not just a question of genetic diversity from the north to the south. The diversity that otters have is going to be different in the south and the north. There's going to be adaptations and genetic alleles that occur in the south that don't occur in the northern populations. So it's actually a two-way exchange of that genetic diversity that's going to be really important. So again, there is hope for amelioration of those problems. And it really gets down to having a distribution that is not so fragmented.
Thanks, Tim. I think that bridges us to the next question, which is what you're suggesting or seeing is more important to sea otter recovery, their habitat or their prey?
Well, I think in that one, there's a relatively simple answer, and that is both. The prey and the habitat are so tightly coupled for sea otters. And I didn't talk too much about behavior or foraging ecology and physiology in this talk. I have in other talks, but I had to sort of focus it down a bit. But the important thing to know about sea otters, Heather's very aware of this, from a physiological behavioral aspect, is that they are swimming furnaces. They have incredibly higher than any other mammal per capita metabolic demands. And that means that they are more energy limited than really anything else. That's from that is part and parcel of their thermal regulation. And the reason I mention that is that prey is so absolutely foundational to them. Sea otters occur in areas where there are high productivity of invertebrates. Now they're very good at generalizing as a population on different types of prey. So that could be high productivity invertebrates in an estuary, on the outer coast, in a sandy embayment, really anywhere. So they are able to adapt to different types of habitat. But the key thing there is that there need to be types of habitats that support healthy, productive benthic invertebrate populations of whatever those invertebrates are: urchins, abalone, clams, crabs, mussels, limpets. It goes. Otters eat about 100 different benthic invertebrate species. So they have a very diverse diet. So that's why when I said both, I meant it. I mean, the key thing about the habitat that's important for them is the prey.
Thanks so much, Tim. I think I have just one question to close on, which is a rather large one, but I'd love to hear your reflections on this idea that sea otter recovery has led to increases in kelp forests, finfish, and seagrass beds, which seems like a good thing. Then you've also shared some results suggesting that sea otters have been known to deplete shellfish like abalone, clams, and crabs, which of course are important resources for people's food and livelihoods, and that could be framed as a bad thing. So the general question is sea otter recovery good or bad or both?
Well, as was my last answer, I'll start with I'll go for the both because that's the low-hanging fruit. But I'll take a step back and reflect on the fact that both those things are true at the same time. And our assessment of them as being good or bad actually those are value judgments.
Mm.
Um, and and I don't mean that in a disparaging way. Value judgments are absolutely important. I mean, no human community can exist without values, right? Every community, every person, every human community has values, and those values differ from place to place depending on all kinds of factors like how they make their living, their cultural backgrounds, all kinds of things. But they're obviously really important. And so depending on your particular set of values, the things that you value most, um, and that the increased resilience of kelp forests is indeed a value. There are a whole bunch of reasons or ways in which that benefits us, right? And we think of that as a good thing, whether that's reducing shoreline erosion or um, supporting kelp fish or all kinds of other factors. We value those things, but those values are not necessarily any more important than the values of, say, a fishing community that's depending on local shellfish resources. So I guess the key thing here is these different groups and communities need to sit down and talk and to discuss values and come that sort of that my response to that first question. Scientists definitely need to be involved, and it's important that those discussions utilize the best available science that we have, because the last thing we want to do is to have people making value assessments on data that's erroneous, or on misinformation. So absolutely scientists need to be involved, but they need to be involved in a supportive role, helping to provide the knowledge and address and answer the questions and allow the types of questions that they pose in their science to be directed by the communities who are impacted by that. So yeah, so the process is a societal level process. And the answer to that question ultimately, therefore, is a societal level answer.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I love thinking about how to connect scientific understanding with some of these processes to build engagement and better understanding of the many diverse perspectives that span these regions. So I really appreciate your time today, your willingness to share all of this information and great knowledge, and hopefully inspiring those of us that joined us to look at some of the notes you mentioned to learn even more. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing. Thank you to Heather and Sea Otter Savvy, along with the many other partners that are hosting Sea Otter Awareness Week. And thank you to all of those of you that have joined today's webinar to learn about sea otters. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and you check out some of the other Sea Otter Awareness Week activities. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It was fun.